This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. We turn from deploying troops at home to deploying them abroad. The New York Times revealed President Trump secretly signed a directive approving the Pentagon's use of military force on foreign soil. He says to target Latin American drug cartels. According to the Times, the order provides the Pentagon authority to direct military operations at sea and on foreign soil against cartels designated by the Trump administration to be terrorist organizations. Last week, Secretary of State Marco Rubio spoke about targeting drug cartels during an interview with the Catholic news outlet EWTN.
It allows us to now target what they're operating and to use other elements of American power, intelligence agencies, the Department of Defense, whatever, to target these groups if we have an opportunity to do it. We have to start treating them as armed terrorist organizations, not simply drug dealing organizations. Right. Drug dealing is the kind of terrorism they're doing, and it's not the only.
Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum lashed out at Trump's move, saying the United States is going to come to Mexico with the military. We cooperate, we collaborate, but there is not going to be an invasion. That's ruled out, absolutely ruled out. President Sheinbaum spoke at a news conference Monday.
I was informed there would be an order, but it has nothing to do with the country of Mexico. It has to do with their country, not our country.
For more, we're joined by Alexander Avina. He has extensively researched and written about capitalism, the U.S.-backed war on drugs and state violence, associate professor of Latin American history at Arizona State University, author of the award-winning book, Specters of Revolution, Peasant Guerrillas in the Cold War Mexican Countryside. Welcome, Democracy Now!, Professor. If you can start off by talking about the significance of this secret directive that Trump has signed for Mexico and beyond.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. This is, I think, a really dangerous directive that threatens to generate and unleash violence throughout any of the Latin American countries that the Trump administration may target under this broadly defined, struggle against terrorism that they are now using to describe their fight against Latin American drug cartels. One of the things that we should start with is to think about how the war on drugs is never really about drugs. It's a war against the way it's unfolded in Latin America in the last 5-6 decades. It's actually a war against poor people. So the Trump administration may say that the targets are, 6 different transnational drug trafficking organizations from Mexico, 2 from Central America, and 1 shadowy one from Venezuela. But the people who are going to suffer from any sort of unilateral U.S. military action in Latin America are everyday civilians and communities, because it's really difficult to discern in many instances who is a narco and who is not a narco for a variety of different reasons. We need to think about how the U.S. historically has used the war on drugs as another way to advance U.S. imperial geopolitical designs in the Western Hemisphere, using it to attack governments that they deem to be a threat to U.S. national security, while at the same time working with unsavory governments who are actually involved in drug trafficking. But because they're anti-communist and authoritarian, the U.S. is willing to work with them. And we have ample examples from history that should play this out.
And yes, Professor, I wanted to follow up with that in terms of this whole idea of this being new for the U.S. military being involved in Latin America. Of course, there were reports that the Delta Force commandos were involved with the Colombian military in the killing of Pablo Escobar in 1993. Of course, the CIA's direct involvement in the killing of Che Guevara, the U.S. military providing air support for the Bay of Pigs invasion. There's so many of these examples of the U.S. military directly intervening in Latin American countries. So this isn't really anything new, is it? What I found most interesting was this doubling of the reward for the capture of Nicolas Maduro, who's already been indicted for drug trafficking here in the United States, even though there's very scant evidence of that in his own home country.
No, you're entirely correct, Juan. I think this is the immediate context of this directive. The way I see it is the the recent announcement that the bounty on Nicolas Maduro had been raised to $50 million because he's alleged by the U.S. government to be the head of this shadowy drug cartel organization called El Cartel de los Soles, or the Cartel of the Suns. And let's recall that there's been regime change efforts and operations against Venezuela going back to the Obama administration, when he designated Venezuela to be a national security threat. During the first Trump administration, they ratcheted up economic sanctions and waged a level of economic warfare that has produced a Great Depression, a U.S.-style Great Depression on different orders of magnitude, according to reporting of Jeff Stein from the Washington Post. In 2020, we had, I think that was the first time that Nicolas Maduro was charged to be involved in drug trafficking efforts into the United States. So this is, I mean, even we don't have time to go back all the way to post World War II and all the different times during the Cold War that the U.S. Used, again, the war on drugs to support pliant authoritarian right-wing allies while going after revolutionary governments. There's numerous instances, but I think in this, the immediate context in this situation is that this is I think it's directed mostly at Venezuela. I think it's part of an attempt to continue regime change operations. And this is, again, Venezuela offers a really interesting case study because the very counter-narcotic efforts that the U.S. is waging against Venezuela attacks and affects everyday people in Venezuela, and then generates the very processes that the Trump administration tries to fight at the U.S.-Mexico border, namely mass displacement and people robbed of the right to stay home, who then flee their country because of this economic warfare and then try to make it into the United States. So that's one of the insidious things about the war on drugs is, one, it's never going to end because it's not about drugs. And two, it generates the very processes that it says it's fighting against. And in this situation, we have a combination of the war on drugs, the global war on terror, and the war on migrants.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you briefly also about how Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum has been dealing with not only the militarization of the border, but now these threats of possible U.S. intervention against the cartels within her own country.
It's really difficult to be a neighbor of the United States, because also what this issue brings up is the U.S.'s historical and current claim that it can violate the national sovereignty of any Latin American Caribbean nation when it sees fit, on whatever premise or justification that it wants to use. Historically, Mexico has had a tense, fraught relationship with the United States because of the United States' unwillingness to recognize the national sovereignty and the self-determination of its southern border. That's why the U.S. has invaded Mexico on several times and taken half of its national territory in the 19th century. So President Claudia Sheinbaum has to walk a tightrope. On the one hand, has to constantly and consistently defend the national sovereignty of her country, but drug trafficking and drug production is a real issue. So how do you collaborate in a cooperative, productive way with a neighbor who for the last 3-4 years has been saying, we want to invade Mexico or engage in different types of military activities against drug trafficking organizations based in Mexico? So she's in a really difficult situation. Her predecessor, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, famously expelled the DEA from Mexico, but military to military relationships and contacts never ended. We have special forces units within the U.S. military who continue to train their counterparts in the Mexican military, plans and programs that have continued under President Sheinbaum. So she's walking a tightrope, and it's really, she also has to deal with the tariff issues. So I would not want to be in her position, but I think what she comes back to is consistently defending the national sovereignty of Mexico, and as she should, as I think is the appropriate way forward.
Thanks for watching Democracy Now! On YouTube. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to make sure you never miss a video. And for more of our audience-supported journalism, go to democracynow.org, where you can download our news app, sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to the daily podcast, and so much more.